I remember much simpler times where you just install your UI library, import the packages you need, and you're pretty much good to go. Now things aren't quite as simple. So let's talk about the current state of modern UI libraries and whether this is something we might live to regret. So one of the earliest component libraries, and if you've been doing web development for a while, you definitely would have heard of this, is Bootstrap. Like 10 years ago, pretty much everyone was using this, and it's purely like a CSS framework. So we have a bunch of components available, and this is the alert component, for example. You would just add some classes to regular divs, and then you get all of these components built out. For more complex components, let's look at like pagination. You see it's built up of different HTML elements, but ultimately we're just applying all of these different classes provided by Bootstrap to eventually get that component rendered out. And that's how component libraries kind of worked in the past before all of these different frameworks existed. We just had CSS, HTML, and then this extra layer of classes on top of all that. Then things started to advance when things like React got more popular, and we had other libraries like Ant Design, probably heard of that one, and Material UI, still a popular one, but it's been around for ages now. And these were super simple. You would just install the library, install the particular component that you cared about, and then render that component on screen. And that's how things lasted for a long, long time. Like we're talking years. And it was quite simple to work that way. But the trouble was that when you wanted to customize things, it could get quite difficult. So most of the time, all of these components would accept properties to change the color, specify variants, like all of the different sizes. But with the more complex components, they would be built up of more than just, say, a single div internally. Say you've got a button and it's got a loading component on it. That would be maybe 2 or 3 different divs. And then trying to pass in props to edit individual elements within a component got quite difficult. Shakra did the same as well. So Shakra is the component library that I tend to use. And they recently upgraded from major version 2 to version 3. So in version 2, very similar to Material UI, you just import the component, so like the button here, render it on screen, pass in things in like the color scheme, the size, and then you get the button rendered out here. So here's an example of buttons of different sizes by just passing in different size properties. But with the announcement of version 3, they've made a huge amount of changes. So this was released back in October 22. Today, we're excited to announce the long-awaited release of Shakra UI version 3. The feedback for Shakra version 3 has been incredible, and we appreciate those who took the time to test and catch bugs. Shakra 3 is a complete rewrite of Shakra to enhance its performance, speed, and consistency across components. We've also added over 25 new components, and that's just the beginning. So then they go on to talk about all the different libraries that have inspired Shakra, and particularly they mention ShadCen for inspiring the CLI and driving the idea of copy-paste snippets, which Shakra now embraces. So this is one of the biggest changes between version 2 and 3 and sort of the direction that modern component libraries seem to be heading. So if we look at the button component in Shakra version 3, you don't actually import a component from Shakra. You run this script now instead. npx Shakra UI CLI snippet add button. And what this will do is actually add a bunch of code to your repository that you can edit to your heart's delight. So if you were to run this script on one of your repositories, you'd end up with a file in your repo that looked a little bit like this. And this is just a simple button component, but it's a pretty big file just for button, right? It's not that one line of code that we had in Shakra 2, at least. So this made me feel quite uncomfortable at the start. And you can see why developers might not like this kind of approach. You know, when you're importing 20 plus different components, you can end up with a huge amount of source code in your repository, which is not always the best thing. But it does mean that in terms of customization, you can go in and change literally anything. You can change the spinner for the loading indicator of the button. You can change how the text label is rendered. And the opportunity for customization is far higher than it was with the old approach. So when they say this was inspired by ShadCen, so ShadCen is also a very popular UI library at the moment, and they have popularized this approach of adding the snippets directly to your source code. So ShadCen has the same sort of commands as Shakra, npx ShadCen at latest add button, and again that will just add all of the source code to your repository. Then once you have button, you can just import it and then render it just as a standard button. But although the customization is way easier now with this kind of setup, there's still something that makes me feel uncomfortable about this. These libraries will obviously be updated by the maintainers, so every time a new version is released. What if they make drastic changes to say how the button works, and then I've already made changes to the snippet that I've added? I feel like I'm going to constantly run into merge conflicts, so I feel generally quite worried about going in and changing any of those generated snippets in case I end up with huge merge conflicts down the line. The other thing as well that I've noticed is, in the case of Shakra, some of the components you generate snippets for, and then you have to import directly from your local source code, and then some of the components, say like badge in this case, come directly from Shakra. So when you're working with this, in reality, it gets really confusing to say, okay, where does the badge come from? Where does the button come from? It would be quite nice if all of the components were added as snippets, or all of them weren't added as snippets, to create some sort of consistency there. Then another major player on the market at the moment is also Tailwind's Catalyst. Now this is an interesting one. It's not actually a UI library at all, it's a UI kit. The reason being, it's just a collection of components which use a combination of Tailwind UI and Headless UI to build out a bunch of nice components. So here we have button, avatar, we've got checkboxes, headings, that kind of stuff. Let's look at the demo page. So this is a demo app built with Catalyst. You can see it looks pretty nice. You wouldn't expect anything less than the guys that made Tailwind. And you don't actually install anything for this at all beyond the open source Tailwind CSS. If you have access to the premium version Tailwind UI, you will already have access to this UI kit as well. You can just click download. That literally just downloads a zip file. You extract that, drag all of the components into your repository, and you're good to go. There is no extra dependencies for Catalyst whatsoever. Now this feels like we've looped all the way back to how Bootstrap worked 10 plus years ago. So it seems like we're going full circle a little bit, giving more control back to the user. But it is difficult to say if this is going to be a trend that we live to regret, or if we'll continue more heavily down that path in the future. Anyway, let me know what you think of how the modern state of UI libraries are looking at the moment. Do you like it? Do you think it's a little bit weird? Let me know in the comments, like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Cheers.